Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Mild History. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Perhaps you are curled up in a quiet bedroom, perhaps traveling on a dimly lit bus, or sitting in the stillness of a late evening. Wherever you are, I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend this time here. Settle down now, find a comfortable position, and let your breathing become slow and shallow. We are not traveling to a place of drama or excitement tonight. Instead, we are settling into a place defined by monotony, soot, and the sheer weight of continuous work. Our journey takes us to the vast, industrialized heart of England, Birmingham, in the quiet, middle decades of the 19th century. This is the origin of the legend, but we are concerned only with the tedious, tiring reality that preceded the myth. Think of the air itself. The sky above Birmingham was not an open, endless expanse. It was a ceiling, fixed and low, made of coal smoke, industrial fumes, and the exhaust of thousands of tiny, repetitive processes. The prevailing color was not blue or white, but a uniform, heavy ochre gray. It was a perpetual, industrialized twilight that dampened the spirit and absorbed the sound. The sun, when it managed to appear, was only a faint, tired disk, offering no real warmth, only a diffused, weak light that seemed to struggle just to exist. This smoke never truly lifted. It was a constant resident. It settled onto everything. The rough surfaces of the stone buildings, the exposed skin of the workers, and the dense wool of their clothing. It coated the very texture of the city with a fine, oily layer of soot and grit. If you were to run a finger along any sill or ledge, you would collect a thick, dark residue, the physical proof of the city's constant, slow labor. The atmosphere was always thick, slightly damp, and always gritty. Now, we begin our slow, quiet walk through the working-class wards through Duddieston, Bordesley, and the densely packed areas of Small Heath. The ground beneath your heavy boots is rough cobblestone, perpetually wet from the damp air, reflecting the weak, tired light of the scattered gas lamps. Listen closely to the sound of your own steps. The shuffling of your boots is not loud. The thick air seems to absorb the sharp edges of sound, making every motion feel heavy and muted. The rhythm of life here was set, not by the clock of the church, but by the relentless, unyielding clock of the factory shift. Imagine the transition from night to morning, around 5:30 or 6. There is no sudden awakening, only the slow, gradual escalation of sound. Thousands of people leave their cramped, back-to-back houses, small, hastily constructed homes built cheaply without much light or air. The noise they make is not a rush or a hurried clamor. It is a profound sound of massed, enduring fatigue. The sound of thousands of heavy, nailed boots tramping slowly, methodically toward the foundry gates, the gun quarter, or the plating mills. Their faces, even at the start of the day, were drawn and soot-streaked, already holding the evidence of insufficient sleep and the anticipation of the next 12-hour shift. Life was a continuous state of recovery that was never fully achieved. The factories were the true masters of Birmingham. They were vast, oppressive structures of brick and stone, their interior spaces filled with noise, intense localized heat, and the unending demand of repetition. Focus on the soundscape of the foundries and rolling mills during the night shift. The doors are often left open, casting a violent, orange-red light onto the narrow, smoky streets outside, a lurid, mesmerizing contrast to the surrounding gloom. The sounds inside are metallic, percussive, and nonstop. There is the deep, underlying rumble of the great rolling mills, a sound that doesn't just enter the ear but vibrates through the chest cavity. This is joined by the loud, repetitive clatter of machinery, the sound of drive belts running on massive, turning wheels, a constant mechanical heartbeat that keeps the city alive and awake. And then, the sound of the workers themselves, though they rarely spoke loudly. Their work was the slow, rhythmic echo of hammer on metal, a sound that was not quick or violent, but measured, deliberate, and continuous for hours on end. The worker was an extension of the machine, repeating the same motion, guiding the iron, turning the crank, pulling the lever, thousands upon thousands of times between one twilight and the next. This monotonous repetition induced a state of quiet, physical sedation, a lowering of ambition that made the passage of time both slower and more exhausting. The work was also defined by intense, localized heat. The blast furnaces and the molds radiated an almost unbearable heat, forcing the men to sweat profusely, only to step back into the cold, damp air of the smog-filled yard. This continuous cycle of heat and cold added another layer of weariness to their bones. Now, follow us away from the factory gates and into the domestic spaces, the areas of true quiet exhaustion. The back-to-back houses were designed for efficiency, not comfort. They were small, cramped, and built in dense blocks, often without proper ventilation or sanitation. These homes felt constantly claustrophobic. The primary sensation inside these homes was dampness. The walls perpetually sweated, staining the cheap wallpaper with streaks of mildew. The clothes hung perpetually heavy with moisture. The soundscape of the domestic interior was low and tired. The slow, continuous drip of condensation or a leaking tap. The low, muffled sound of coughs from lungs perpetually irritated by the cold dust. The gentle, patient sound of mothers tending to small, low fires in the grate, trying to stretch a few thin calories into a meal. In these spaces, there was no room for dramatic planning or grand gestures. There was only the quiet, endless scramble for caloric and physical stability. The children, often barefoot, navigated the damp alleys not for play, but to run errands, to collect scrap, or to perform small, necessary tasks in the factory yards. Their movement was a quiet, constant motion, a form of low-level hunting for survival. At the weary end of the long shift, the men did not seek spectacle. They sought anesthesia. They shuffled toward the neighborhood alehouses, small, dark rooms, barely illuminated by weak, hissing gaslight. The beer they drank was often thin, weak, and sour, but it offered a small, necessary break from the ache of their muscles and the constant mental pressure of the factory clock. The atmosphere in these pubs was one of low, continuous background sound. The gentle, muffled murmur of conversations that didn't dare to rise to true loudness. The low, resonant clink of ceramic mugs on the rough, sticky wood of the bar. The slow, deliberate movement of tired men lifting the heavy mugs to their lips. This was a place for stalling the inevitable, for delaying the final moment when exhaustion would pull them into their beds, only for the clock to demand their presence again in a few short hours. The geography of the working districts, the narrow, dark courts, the sudden high walls, the short sight lines, contributed to a feeling of constant, contained pressure. It was an environment that bred low-level, simmering resentment and minor, localized conflicts. The constant proximity, the perpetual lack of air and light, and the shared, unyielding exhaustion meant that insults and minor slights were always close at hand. The tension was not dramatic. It was a continuous, quiet hum beneath the surface of the working day. This is the Birmingham that truly mattered, the city of monotonous routine, profound fatigue, and quiet survival. There was no room for the theatrical, only for the repetitive, necessary labor. The man who eventually became the Peaky Blinder was first and foremost a tired, soot-streaked factory worker, defined by the sound of the steam, the grit of the air, and the simple, desperate need to wake up and repeat the entire, exhausting cycle once again. The smoke never lifted. It simply learned to sleep with them. And tonight, we too will let that heavy, continuous blanket of history pull us down into a deep, long rest. Allow the gentle, low hiss of the steam and the rhythmic, distant clatter to settle in your mind. Focus only on the heavy, damp texture of the air and drift. The city of smoke, as we have established, was a place of continuous, grinding exhaustion. It was in this environment, where every surface was soiled and every hour was spent in monotonous labor, that the need for a separate, defined identity began to take root. The first faint, yet recognizable, stirrings of the Peaky Blinders emerged from this industrial gloom, not as an army, but as a subtle, collective decision by young men to simply look different. We can fix this moment in the historical record around the late 1880s. Before this period, The streets were controlled by a variety of local, loosely organized youth groups with forgettable names: the Sloggers, the Scuttlers, the 40 Thieves. These names spoke only of their function: fighting, rushing, stealing. But the term Peaky Blinders carried a different, more lasting weight. The name itself is the first point of quiet historical ambiguity. The dramatic, enduring myth, the image of razor blades sewn into the peaks of their caps to blind an opponent, is a thrilling thought, but it must be set aside for the sake of true, dull history. The reality of the thin, flexible safety razor blade, the necessary technology to make that feat even remotely possible, simply did not exist widely in the working-class districts during the gang's formation. It's a colorful piece of folklore, born of newspaper sensationalism, not the dreary truth of the street. The truth, as usual, is far more simple and monotonous. The name likely came from the single, most defining piece of their uniform: the flat cap itself. When pulled low over the forehead, the stiff peak of the cap cast a deep shadow, partially obscuring or blinding the wearer's eyes. It was a deliberate, quiet technique of non-engagement, a physical posture of silent refusal to look anyone, whether police or superior, directly in the eye. Alternatively, and equally non-dramatically, the name may have referred to the way the weak light of a gas lamp or the faint, diffused daylight might peeked or glinted off the carefully polished leather of the cap's visor. This small, sharp flash of light in the pervasive visual gloom was enough to draw the eye, making the wearer momentarily, quietly conspicuous. The crucial point is this: the blinders were defined by their uniform first, and their actions second. The young men who formed these early groups were, by necessity, products of the factory floor. They were apprentices, mill hands, and factory laborers who had spent their formative years in the relentless, repetitive cycle of the 12-hour shift. They had little money, less leisure, and a pervasive, internalized sense of invisibility granted to them by the overwhelming scale of industrial Birmingham. The step into becoming a Peaky Blinder was not a shift toward becoming a wealthy master criminal. It was a shift toward visible self-respect. It was an act of quiet, persistent sartorial discipline. Let us observe the daily routine of this emerging identity. It begins, not with a criminal plot, but with meticulous, slow maintenance. Imagine the young man in his small, damp room. The first, ritualistic act of the day is the polishing of his heavy leather boots. This was a process that demanded patience and repetitive motion. The rhythmic, low swish of the cloth against the thick leather was a soundtrack of quiet pride. He was forcing the surface of the leather to reflect light, to momentarily deny the constant, dulling layer of coal soot that threatened to swallow all color and texture. The shine on the boots became a statement. Though I walk through filth, I present myself cleanly. Next came the clothes, which were often the sum total of his investment. They were not comfortable. The wool coat was heavy, coarse, and hot when near the foundry, and perpetually damp when outside. The stiff collar and the neatly knotted silk scarf were restrictive, requiring a particular, controlled movement of the head and shoulders. This clothing was a physical discipline, forcing the wearer to move slowly, deliberately, and with an air of measured calm. They consciously chose styles that mimicked the middle-class professional or the successful horse-track betting man. The tailored coat with pearl buttons, the distinctive bell-bottom trousers, these were all signals of aspiration and control. They sought to be mistaken for men who had time to kill and money to lose, rather than men who were defined by the factory clock. The primary occupation that sustained the early gangs was illegal bookmaking. This was not the grand, strategic crime of fiction, but a low-level, continuous financial transaction that required immense patience. Picture the scene again. A man stands in the cold, shadowed corner of a pub yard, near the single, flickering gas lamp. He is waiting for the telegram results from a distant racetrack. His tools are a stubby pencil and a handful of small betting slips. The crime is the slow, meticulous scribbling of names and small amounts of cash, pennies and sixpences, into a heavily folded, sweat-stained record book. This illicit trade was the foundation of their power. It gave them a non-factory income, a way to occupy the endless gray hours between shifts, and a reason to demand a small, quiet measure of respect from the local community, which depended on them for its small, fleeting excitements. The continuous, low-voiced murmur of placing bets, the quick, subtle movement of coin into the palm. These were the true sounds of the Peaky Blinders' early underworld. The life of these Peaky men was therefore a blend of extreme, repetitive labor and monotonous waiting time. Hours were spent standing in the cold drizzle, waiting for the results of a race, waiting for a bet to be paid, or simply waiting for a quiet, subtle opportunity to assert their presence. Their existence was governed by the same slow, enduring patience as the industrial machine that employed them, a continuous, low-frequency pressure, punctuated by only the briefest, most necessary acts of visibility. They were not, at this stage, the violent, strategic masters of Birmingham. They were simply boys with empty pockets and time to kill, who poured their few resources into the maintenance of a uniform. They sought to be acknowledged in a city that preferred them to be invisible. Their clean lines and polished boots were a quiet, powerful defiance against the soot-thick air and the continuous, exhausting demand of the industrial age. This was the true, monotonous genesis of the Peaky Blinders, a deliberate, slow-motion act of style and pride against the suffocating reality of the late Victorian slum. Let the image of the young man, standing silently with his cap pulled low, his boots shining faintly in the gaslight, settle in your mind now. Focus on the weight of his wool coat, the slight scratching of the pencil on the betting slip, and allow yourself to drift into the quiet rhythm of the city's heart. We have successfully established the mood of exhaustion and the necessity of the uniform. Now, we move into the actual crimes, stretching the acts of low-level friction into slow, tedious still lives to maintain the calm, droning atmosphere. If we are to maintain our commitment to mild history, we must divest ourselves entirely of the sensational image of the Peaky Blinders' criminality. Their reality was not a sequence of thrilling, cinematic heists. It was a tedious, continuous cycle of low-grade friction, bureaucratic processing, and financial necessity. Their criminal life was simply another extension of the exhaustion that defined the industrial age. We are looking now at the police records and court reports of the 1890s, dry, factual accounts that capture the true scale of the Blinders' activities. The picture that emerges is one of drudgery, not daring. Crime for them was a form of inefficient, high-risk labor, necessitated by the low wages of the factories. Their criminal activities can be broken down into three highly repeatable, monotonous categories, each lacking any true glamour or long-term reward: petty theft and opportunistic pickpocketing. This was the most common activity, a quiet, necessary scramble for quick cash. The blinder would position himself not in a dramatic location, but simply where crowds were thickest and most tired, at the factory gate during shift change, or near the crowded, slow-moving lines at the market stalls. The act itself was one of subtle, slow motion. The imperceptible brush against the mark, the quiet drawing of a thin wallet or a cheap watch. The sound of the transaction was almost non-existent, a slight rustle of wool, the soft clink of a few coins. The haul was usually minimal, a few shillings, barely enough to cover a day's worth of food and the cost of the next day's coal. It was a caloric transaction, quickly executed and quickly spent. Illegal wagering and betting. As we know, bookmaking was their core business, a constant, low-level defiance of the law. This involved long, static periods of waiting in the cold. A blinder might stand still for hours in a shadowed alleyway, near a corner that offered a quick escape, his attention entirely focused on the slow, meticulous recording of small debts and small bets. The crime was simply a matter of paper and arithmetic. The sound was the low scratching of a pencil stub on thin, greasy paper, a continuous, repetitive sound that spoke of low-margin risk and high-stress counting, street brawls, and disorderly conduct. These were the moments that occasionally caught the eye of the press, but in reality, they were often just the exhausted overflow of stress and low pride. A fight was rarely about territory. It was about insulted dignity over a forgotten debt, or an unintentional bump in the crowd. Let us stretch the moment of a typical street fight into a profound, tired still life. The atmosphere is cold and damp. The air is thick with smoke and fog. The tension builds, not quickly, but with a slow, simmering resentment. The words are exchanged in low, tired voices. Then, the inevitable, clumsy shove. The fight itself is not a ballet of cinematic violence. It is a heavy, tired exchange of slow, often poorly aimed punches, hampered by the weight of their own thick wool coats and heavy boots. When a man falls to the wet cobblestones, the sound is a heavy, muffled thud, a sound instantly absorbed by the industrial noise and the dense atmosphere. The consequence is not a dramatic injury, but a minor laceration or a painful, bruised rib, an injury that will simply make the next 12-hour shift in the foundry unbearable. If a weapon was used, it was often with a sense of monotonous necessity, not fury. The slow drawing of a small, dull knife from the coat pocket, done with an expression of tired routine. Violence came quietly, like a cough you'd been ignoring all week. It was a small, unfortunate incident, not a strategic move. The true punishment of this criminal life was the paperwork that followed. Imagine the police station in the dead of the night. It is a place of cold, damp bureaucracy. The gaslight is weak, casting long, wavering shadows. The smell is of wet wool, stale tobacco, and cheap disinfectant. A weary police constable sits hunched over a large, leather-bound official ledger. The officer's hand moves with painful, slow deliberation, forced to translate the brief, messy chaos of the street into the precise, emotionless language of the report. He dips his quill pen, and the slow, rhythmic scratching of the point on the thick paper becomes the soundtrack of the processing. He records the names, the mundane nature of the crime, and the predictably minor injuries. He writes the same charges, assault and battery, wagering, disorderly conduct, and the same depressing names appear on the page, week after monotonous week. The ledger is the silent graveyard of the Blinders' energy. Every entry is a testament to the repetitive, exhausted loop of their existence. The court appearance the next morning is merely the final, dull confirmation of the cycle. A magistrate, tired and reading by weak daylight, issues a fine, a small, but financially significant subtraction from the family's income, or a short, cold stint in prison. Imprisonment, for a man living at the absolute margin, was a cold, damp break from the factory, but it was not a reform. It was simply a pause before the inevitable return to the same street corner, the same bookmaking routine, the same factory gate. The entire experience of crime for the Peaky Blinder was characterized by fatigue and predictability. It was not about grand power. It was about the low-level friction required to stay afloat. They were not great schemers. They were tired men repeating exhausted acts in a city that itself was too tired to notice. The monotonous routine of the factory fed the monotonous routine of the crime, and the monotonous routine of the law processed both. The result was a continuous, low-energy cycle, utterly devoid of the dramatic flair that would later define the myth. Let the slow, scratching sound of the constable's pen and the drip of the condensation settle in your mind now. Focus on the feeling of low-grade exhaustion that pervaded every action, and allow yourself to drift further down into the quiet, dark history. We continue to deepen the atmosphere of quiet exhaustion. We've covered the environment and the monotonous nature of the crime. Now, we focus on the central image of the entire story, the uniform itself. Let us now turn our slow, patient attention to the single, most enduring image of the real Peaky Blinders, their uniform. This was not a random choice of attire. It was a meticulously constructed piece of psychological and social armor, built out of necessity in a world that sought to render them nameless. To truly understand the men is to understand the texture, the weight, and the silent symbolism of what they wore. In the smoky, anonymous chaos of late Victorian Birmingham, where faces were perpetually smudged and identities were swallowed by the factory, the uniform was an act of quiet defiance. It was a continuous, visible statement that said, "We are men of purpose, and we demand recognition." We will examine each piece slowly, focusing on its physical properties, the reality that was felt on the skin, not the myth that was seen on the stage. First, the centerpiece, the flat cap. This was the garment that gave the gang its name and its silhouette. It was typically made of thick, dark wool or heavy tweed, a necessary fabric for function. Think of the coarse, damp feel of the wool against the hand, the way the fabric absorbed the coal smoke, holding on to that faint, perpetual smell of soot and wet grit. The cap's primary function was to be functional against the incessant Birmingham rain and cold. When pulled low, the stiff peak created a private, darkened space for the eyes, a quiet barrier between the man's inner self and the chaotic, pressing world outside. It was a simple, physical tool for creating distance and anonymity within the crowd. It allowed the man to observe without necessarily being observed in return. Next, the coat. This was perhaps the most financially significant investment a blinder made. It was a heavy, dark wool or fustian overcoat, often tailored to be neat and form-fitting. The true purpose of this coat was to serve as a clean, respectable shell over the rough, sweat-stained, and soot-marked clothes of the factory floor. It was a deliberate, total burial of the daily drudgery. The weight of the wool was substantial, a constant, physical presence on the shoulders that offered comfort against the cold, but also enforced a certain slow, measured gait. A man wearing a coat of this weight simply could not rush or scurry. He was forced to move with a deliberate, stately slowness. The immaculate stitching and clean lines, a stark contrast to the rough brick and messy alleys, were a silent argument for dignity. Now the boots. The footwear was the highest point of sartorial discipline. The boots were heavy, thick-soled, and high-laced leather, built for the rigors of standing on cold, concrete factory floors and navigating the treacherous, wet cobblestones. But they were prized not for their function, but for their sheen. The ritual of polishing the leather was central to the blinder's routine. It was a slow, meditative, and repetitive act, the low, continuous swish of the cloth creating an almost mirror-like finish. This high polish was a daily defiance of the soot and the damp. It ensured that even on the dreariest day, there was a single, sharp glint of reflected light whenever the boot moved. The polish was a visible, persistent symbol of the man's unyielding pride in the face of absolute material scarcity. The trousers and waistcoat. The trousers were high-waisted and held up by heavy braces. They were made of thick, hard-wearing material. The distinct wide-bottom or bell-bottom shape, though fashionable, also dictated a certain swing and rhythm to the walk, a slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic stride that further distinguished them from the rushed, ragged movements of the common laborer. The waistcoat, often fastened with pearl or metal buttons, added another layer of formality and structure. These layers created a sense of stiffness and restraint, forcing the body into a posture of controlled, quiet aggression. Finally, the silk scarf. This was the garment that provided a small, unnecessary, yet potent flash of color or pattern, worn tightly knotted around the neck, often against a starched, stiff collar. The silk was the only truly fine, non-functional material in the entire outfit. It was an aspirational whisper, a tiny piece of luxury appropriated from the upper classes and worn in the smoky alleyway. The scarf was entirely symbolic. It did nothing to keep the man warm, but everything to announce his quiet ambition to escape the gray monotony. The entire uniform worked as a unified psychological shield. The uniform demanded a certain slow, patient movement. The weight of the wool, the stiffness of the collar, and the heavy boots required the wearer to be measured, deliberate, and calm. The clothes themselves were an instruction: do not hurry. Do not panic. Remain still and quiet. This air of studied control was far more intimidating on the street than any sudden burst of energy. The man was encased in his own dignity, forcing the world, from the constable to the factory foreman, to approach him with a moment's pause. The most profound realization about the uniform is its lack of true comfort. It was stiff, hot when working, and often damp from the continuous Birmingham drizzle. It was a self-imposed discipline, a way of using physical discomfort to maintain mental resolve. By wearing their poverty neatly, they turned the symbols of low status into the tools of pride. They wore their clean, pressed attire not to commit glamorous crimes, but to go to work in a soot-streaked factory, and then to quietly, patiently collect small bets in a damp pub. The uniform was the central, unhurried ritual of their daily lives, the slow, necessary process of transforming the anonymous man into the acknowledged Peaky Blinder. Let the subtle scent of coal smoke mixed with damp, thick wool drift over you now. Feel the imaginary stiffness of the collar against your neck. Focus on the single, sharp glint of light from the polished boot, and let the weight of the wool gently pull you down into deeper, uninterrupted rest. We will now transition from the uniformed men to the tired, equally monotonous mechanism designed to contain them, the Victorian police system. As we continue our slow journey through Birmingham's quiet underworld, we encounter the other constant presence in the streets, the forces of law and order, the Watchers. Just as the Peaky Blinders were defined by exhaustion and routine, so too were the Victorian police constables. Their existence was governed by the same industrial clock and the same monotonous repetition as the factory workers they policed. The constables of the late 19th century were not agents of high drama or brilliant detection. They were underpaid, overworked, and condemned to tramp the same familiar, sooty streets on endless, predictable patrol routes. Their job was one of low-level, continuous maintenance, managing the friction of a city that was perpetually at its breaking point. Imagine the life of a typical constable walking his beat in the Small Heath district. His uniform is heavy, dark blue wool, functional but always slightly damp and never truly clean of the prevailing soot. His day is measured not in arrests, but in the slow, heavy mileage covered. The sound of his own nailed boots hitting the wet cobblestones became the hypnotic, repetitive soundtrack of his life. A continuous, low thud on the beat, a sound that told the blinders exactly how far away he was. His duties rarely involved the thrilling chase. They were primarily walking, the endless, repetitive act of covering the same ground, over and over, under the same gray sky. Recording, the tedious documentation of minor incidents, small thefts, and property damage. Mediating, the patient separation of tired, drunken men arguing over trivial debts in the pubs. Moving on, the routine dispersal of vagrants and loiterers who sought temporary shelter from the weather. The relationship between the constable and the local gangs was one of weary, mutual familiarity. They were two populations forced into perpetual, close proximity by the narrow geography of the working ward. The constable knew their names. He knew the addresses of their families, the pubs they favored, and the exact hour they finished their shift. The blinders knew his. They knew his patrol schedule, the length of his smoke break, and the moment he would turn the corner onto the next block. This was not a war. It was a slow, choreographed dance of acknowledgement. It was a continuous, low-stakes ritual of defiance and containment that rarely escalated into true conflict. The dance never ended. It simply paused before beginning again. The true heart of the law's monotonous power resided in the station house, a place of cold stone, damp air, and unrelenting bureaucracy. Picture the charge desk in the early hours of the morning, after an arrest has been made. The gaslight in the office is weak, flickering, and casts long, wavering shadows that deepen the atmosphere of fatigue. The air smells faintly of wet wool, cheap soap, and stale tobacco. The atmosphere is defined by paperwork. When a blinder was brought in, often bruised, cold, and exhausted, the constable's next, most crucial duty was to convert the messy, 5-minute reality of the street into the precise, emotionless language of the official ledger. The ledger was the anchor of the loop, a massive, heavy, leather-bound book with thick, aging pages. The constable sat hunched over the desk, his hand moving with painful, slow deliberation, dipping his quill pen into the ink pot. The sound of the quill pen scratching and scraping on the thick, official report paper became the soundtrack of the processing, a continuous, low, repetitive noise that symbolized the system absorbing the incident. He recorded the same charges, assault and battery, wagering in public, loitering with intent, and, with predictable repetition, the same tired names: Small, Dunn, Taylor. Each entry was a bureaucratic footnote, utterly devoid of the heat, anger, or economic necessity that had fueled the incident. The incident was stripped of its humanity, reduced to ink on a page. The next morning, the magistrate's court served as the next phase of this repetitive loop. It was a dull, gray room where tired officials listened to tired testimonies. The outcome was almost always the same, following a strict tariff of penalties: a small fine or a short custodial sentence. A predictable, finite consequence that simply reset the Blinders' position in the loop. A fine was a direct subtraction from the family's precarious financial balance, a pressure that would inevitably lead to more petty crime. A short imprisonment was simply a cold, damp, necessary rest from the factory floor, a brief pause before the man was released back onto the street, ready to resume his routine. The system was designed not for reform, but for containment, a slow, patient process of absorbing the friction of the industrial age. The city itself became a vast, monotonous loop, managed by the weary constables. Patrol. The constable's boot hits the cobblestone, thud thud thud. Incident. The blinder acts out of exhausted pride or necessity. Report. The quill pen scratches the same name onto the heavy ledger page. Release. The blinder is returned to the street, his debt paid. Repeat. The constable resumes his walk, knowing the names will return. The power of the law in this era was not its speed or its brilliance, but its unyielding, dull repetition. It mirrored the factory, continuous, low energy, and inescapable. The constable knew the blinders would be back. The blinders knew the constable would be waiting. The mutual, tired acknowledgement kept the city's undercurrent of tension stable, ensuring that the drudgery of crime was equally matched by the drudgery of containment. Let the slow, heavy thud of the constable's boot and the continuous scratching of the pen settle in your mind now. Focus on the feeling of low, ambient pressure that pervaded the streets, and allow the rhythmic process of law to lull you into deep, peaceful sleep. We have established the setting, smoke, the characters, tired, uniformed, the conflict, monotonous crime, and the containment, weary bureaucracy. Now, we move into the quiet demise of the original gangs. All structures born of tension and place are eventually consumed by the passage of time. The Peaky Blinders, as a distinct, uniform threat, did not end in a sudden clash or a final, dramatic confrontation. Their end was far more appropriate to their existence. They simply faded away, dissolved slowly by the relentless, quiet forces of industrial and social modernity. We fixed this moment around the years leading up to 1910. The city of Birmingham, which had created the perfect claustrophobic conditions for the blinders to exist, was beginning to change its shape, and these changes stripped the gangs of the geography and anonymity they depended upon. The moment of their obsolescence was one of quiet, historical anticlimax. The central catalyst was the shift in transport and infrastructure. The old city, where life revolved around the pace of a slow walk or the heavy, rhythmic clop-clop-clop of the horse-drawn dray cart, was vanishing. The introduction of the electric tram was a profound, dull revolution. The tram was faster, smoother, and followed established, main routes. It brought with it a low, continuous hum and whine, a sound of mechanical efficiency that replaced the predictable, earthy rhythm of the horse. This new speed and reach broke down the insular, densely packed geography of the Peaky Blinders territory. People could now travel further, more quickly, to and from work. The factory worker was no longer trapped in the dense labyrinth of back-to-back, housing adjacent to the mill. The territories were dissolving. The gangs relied on the slow, contained movement of people to spot opportunities, collect debts, and maintain control. The speed of the tram was simply too fast for their localized, on-foot structure to control. Their world of narrow, wet alleys was bypassed by the smooth, predictable line of the electrical cable. Furthermore, the nature of organized crime itself was evolving. The Peaky Blinders, with their focus on betting and petty, territorial friction, were a product of the rough-and-tumble late Victorian era. By the early 20th century, the stakes were increasing and the rewards required more sophistication. The blinders were slowly replaced by larger, more enduring organizations, groups that adapted to industrial modernity. These new gangs were more focused on the centralized economics of gambling and large-scale protection rackets. They were less reliant on the visible uniform and the open-air street fight. They required invisibility and bureaucratic cunning, not conspicuous presence. The blinders, with their easily identifiable flat caps, pearl buttons, and tailored coats, became anachronisms. Their uniform, once their armor of dignity, was now a liability. It made them too conspicuous in a new criminal landscape that valued subtlety and discretion. They were a visible target in a world that demanded quiet efficiency. The decline of the gang was fundamentally an issue of demographics and natural attrition. The men did not die spectacularly, they simply aged out. Imagine the process. One by one, the blinders grew older. They married. They had children. They sought marginally more stable, though still utterly exhausting, jobs that offered a consistent wage. The necessity of maintaining a sharp, high-risk, low-reward lifestyle was outweighed by the sheer, heavy weight of domestic responsibility. The slow, patient dedication previously reserved for polishing their boots was now redirected into paying the rent and securing coal for the family grate. The men simply disappeared back into the smoke from whence they came. The process was quiet, individual, and deeply anticlimactic. A man would sell his expensive, sharp wool coat for practical money. He would stop polishing his boots to a mirror shine, letting the soot finally claim the leather. He would exchange the symbolic silk scarf for a practical, rough woolen muffler. He would let his cap remain undipped, simply an old man's hat against the cold. The great, imposing presence of the Peaky Blinder dissolved into memory, one tired man at a time. The sound that accompanied this dissolution was not a roar, but a profound quietude, the silence of the factory closing down, the massive iron gate finally creaking shut and being locked for the last time, leaving behind only the distant, low hum of the trams passing in the distance. History forgot their faces, focusing only on the sharp, iconic silhouette. The men themselves became smoke, anonymous, transient, and utterly absorbed by the continuous, gray reality of the city. Their story ends not with an act of violence, but with an act of quiet, collective fading. It is a profound, dull reminder that in the long, slow, boring history of a working-class city, obsolescence is the most common form of death. They were an expression of a moment in time, a unique product of the narrow, smoky streets of late 19th century Birmingham. When the streets widened and the economy demanded new, quieter forms of organization, the function of the uniformed blinders ceased. The whole thing passed with the slow, almost unnoticeable rhythm of a watch winding down, a quiet, gentle end to a noisy, low-stakes life. Allow the low, receding sound of the electric tram and the soft, distant wind passing over the rooftops to settle your mind now. Focus on the profound, long silence that follows the closing of a factory gate and drift away with the fading smoke. We have reached the quiet conclusion of our story. The real Peaky Blinders, the tired, uniformed youths who managed small bets and fought brief, clumsy skirmishes, dissolved into the anonymous smoke of 1910. Yet, their myth, their colorful silhouette, remains vividly with us today, a bright, captivating illusion projected onto the dark screen of history. This final segment is a quiet reflection on the mechanism of romanticism, how the dull, exhausting facts of poverty and routine were slowly, patiently transformed into the spectacular drama we associate with the name. The initial foundation of the myth was laid, as always, in the old newspapers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The local Birmingham papers, perpetually hungry for stories that would sell copies and distract from the dreary reality of industrial life, seized upon the gang's most visible trait, the sharp, distinctive uniform. Journalists, sitting in their dry, warm offices, took the petty friction, the small, tired brawls over a sixpence debt, and magnified them into grand narratives of turf war. They amplified the visual elements, inventing the idea of the razor blades in the caps because the real story of a tired boy using a small, dull knife in a fit of exhausted pride was simply too monotonous to print. The paperwork and the fatigue of the street were meticulously scrubbed away, replaced by the necessary fantasy of charismatic evil. This sensationalism created a powerful visual shorthand that endured for a century. Now, consider the profound psychological leap that takes place when we consume the modern dramatization. We are looking for escape from our own modern, small anxieties, and we find it in the past, but only when that past is made exciting. The true Peaky Blinder was a victim of economic necessity and the factory schedule. His life was a slow, continuous scramble to make up for the scarcity of his wages. The man of the myth, however, is a figure of total control and immense wealth, a person who dictates his own time and destiny. The contrast is the distance between exhaustion and escape. The act of romanticizing these men is a collective desire to believe that desperation can be beautiful. We prefer the idea that poverty breeds cunning and style, rather than the dreary, historic truth that it breeds fatigue and quiet, persistent desperation. We turn the symbols of their reality into the tools of fantasy. The flat cap, which was a mundane, woolen shield against the rain and soot, became a crown fitted with hidden blades. The polished boots, which were a statement of quiet, personal discipline against the pervasive filth, became the tools of silent, calculated intimidation. The tailored coat, which was a heavy, necessary armor against cold and anonymity, became the stylish uniform of an unstoppable crime lord. The entire transformation rests on our ability to forget the sensory reality of their lives. The constant smell of coal smoke and wet wool, the persistent ache in the feet from standing too long, the monotonous sound of the factory machine. We forget the dull hours of waiting and counting bets and remember only the moment of the fictional climax. The voice of history, when speaking the truth of the Peaky Blinders, is not a boast. It is a whisper of weariness. It is the story of men who were trapped, who wore their pride as a temporary, fragile shield, and who ultimately faded into the great, anonymous cloud of working-class history. Their legacy is not a lesson in how to build an empire, but a quiet, enduring reminder of how quickly the truth of struggle is washed away and replaced by a more comfortable, exciting lie. They were not heroes, and they were never truly kings. They were just men trying, with all their limited resources, to be seen in a city that was determined to look away. The entire history is now a quiet sound, a low hum, a settling of accounts. The final minutes of their story should be the final, gentle moments of your wakefulness. The voice fades to a near whisper. Perhaps it was not the blades in their caps, but the glint in their eyes. The last, small spark of men, trying to be seen, before the smoke finally took them. The effort is over now. The story has ended. The sound of the struggle is fading. Allow the gentle, low sound of the rain and the distant, quiet echoes of the closed factories to settle your mind. You are safe now. There is only the long, deep silence of history. Sleep now. Sleep.